Okay, what's up? I'm going to talk about slavery a bit. I'm not, obviously not any kind of expert on slavery. Just to clear up a few things. A lot of this is based on what I've learned from a guy called Thomas Sowell, who writes these amazing books. He's mainly an economist, but he's also done research on other things, culture and I don't know, race and various things. But yeah, so with slavery, I think for a lot of people, the first thing that comes to mind is the black slaves in America. I don't know when it started, but up to about 1850. That's the famous example. And I think already there's a bit of an issue because slavery is a worldwide phenomenon. It has existed, I don't know if people realize, for thousands of years all over the world. So in that sense, America is not an especially race is another separate thing. That's the other thing. Slavery is not really associated with race, or at least it wasn't originally. I'll get more into that later, but it's a worldwide phenomenon that's existed everywhere. So what's much more interesting, in fact, I think slavery started before writing systems did. There's evidence seems to suggest that. Thomas Sowell said it, Wikipedia said it, so it must be true. Um, it's a bit similar to poverty. Poverty's existed for a very long time, and people keep wondering, oh, why are some people poor? The more meaningful question is, how did some people become rich, or how did some places become wealthy? And I think the answer is largely through trade, through exchanges, and through free market capitalism, competition. That's what drives it. Division of labor, different people doing what they're best at, different places having different resources, and they share and they get better. And I think in many ways it's the same with culture and technology. Places that are isolated tend to fall way behind. The Aboriginals in Australia, the Native Indians in America, a lot of the Africans. It's no criticism of them. Their culture might be all really cool and interesting. Some people might like to live that way now or hypothetically in the past. I also think, though, a lot of it's really overly romanticized. We don't see all the statistics. That's the thing with technology. As the internet gets better, we become more aware of things, of facts. So it seems like certain things are getting worse when they may actually be getting better. Like I think the levels of violence are going down and down worldwide, but we keep hearing about all the acts of violence. So, people think of being an Aboriginal as being, at peace with the nature and all of that. And did stealing ever occur, or murder, or rape? Like, there's no statistics, or none that I know of. Again, I'm not picking on them. I just think it's human nature. Do you really think, rich Western society is evil, and these old, beautiful cultures that are just, you just have to look at nature, look at the way animals treat each other, to see how ugly and messy it is compared to other systems that we've got. But anyway, just in terms of, development, the Aboriginals didn't have anything. They were poor, living in poverty by, I think, pretty much any definition. Not necessarily a bad way of life, not criticizing that, but by comparison, places like Europe or, I don't know, like Italy, where you've got the Renaissance, and I don't know, England, all these places where they were trading a lot and exchanging ideas. They used to have Roman numerals, but then they took up Arabic numerals because it's way better. It's better. And they didn't stubbornly stick with their system. They try to, or I mean, they could, but those that adopted the better system to take the advantages. And you see things just get better and better. It doesn't matter how you feel about it. Western society, Western culture is far bigger and richer than Aboriginal culture. Again, no offense, but the symphonies of Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, all that music, paintings and art. I mean, I like music, so that's what I tend to think of. Literature. I don't know if the Aboriginals even had a way of writing. But anyway, let's focus on slavery. So this is what I'm meant to be talking about. So the point is not to ask, okay, so how did poverty arise? It's how did poverty end? How did wealth begin? And with slavery, it's not, well, why is slavery occurring in these places? It was everywhere. How did slavery end? What's interesting is the places where it seemed to end were mainly England and America, for example. I think England was one of the main places that was going out of its, first off, ended slavery, or tried to, in the early 1800s, 1830, around then, or maybe earlier. There seems to be sort of stages. Like, I think they stopped importing slaves at a certain point. And then a bit later, they eventually said, okay, you can't have a slave, you can't own slaves. But they might have exceptions for criminals and stuff. But also, England went, I'm pretty sure, way out of their way to try to prevent further sort of slaves being taken out of Africa, I think the west coast of Africa, by other countries. Like they were at expense to themselves. They were trying to actively fight against slavery. I'm pretty sure the founding fathers in America were not in support of slavery, but for practical reasons. It wasn't feasible to try to fight slavery at that point, to try to completely get rid of it. I think quite a few people back then recognized freeing the slaves could actually cause more problems and make it difficult for those freed people. It wasn't you got to pick your fights and pick your times. But anyway, and yeah, 1850 they tried to fight and get rid of slavery. Slavery still existed in various other places. I think Eastern Europe, maybe. The word slave comes from the word Slav, or relates to it, which I guess the Slavic people are, I don't know if Russians count, but lots of those Eastern European countries. Slavery is not a white versus black thing, or if it is, it goes both ways. There are plenty of white European slaves that were taken to Africa. That's the other thing with race. If you go way, way back, and again, a lot of this stuff, if you just think about it logically, makes sense. But it goes against a lot of what people take for granted as, obviously slavery is all about superior whites, or supposedly superior, putting down blacks. And every problem that blacks face in America these days is a legacy of slavery. It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, more on that later. If you go way back to like ancient Egypt, they enslaved Egyptians. The Egyptians enslaved Egyptians. I don't know other examples, but most societies enslaved their own people. Genetically, they would have been identical or very similar. And you had this, very rigid class structures, I think in most places, like a hierarchy. It wasn't until much later, again, like I said, where you've got the isolated cultures, they don't really develop. They might have their nice, beautiful, peaceful way of life. It's just so beautiful. But in Europe, you've got all this exchanging going on, all these, they get paper and fire powder, gunpowder or whatever from China, or fireworks, whatever. I don't know who invented it, The Arabics were doing really cool maths in the 9th or 10th centuries or something like that. All the different cultures doing their cool things and sharing. You've got the Renaissance, you've got the ancient Greeks, some of that gets passed on later or rediscovered. A huge amount of growth, to the point that Europe was this, or say England was very powerful and was able to travel all the way to Africa and enslave those people because they were way advanced. Okay, of course, I'm not justifying it. I think slavery is terrible, but the pattern is humans, and Thomas Sowell points this out. If you could draw a pattern from all of this information, it's that human beings who have more power than other human beings tend to abuse it. It's very common. But yeah, that difference did not occur because of slavery. This difference had already occurred in technology and power, weapons and whatnot, due to interacting cultures and trading over time as opposed to being isolated. And that's what enabled them to enslave. And again, that's when it first became about race. The fact that the whites could go all the way to Africa, bring large chunks of black people all the way to America and enslave them. But it wasn't out of racism. It wasn't due to racism. And if anything, it was just they thought they were inferior because they didn't have technology. I mean, I don't know the details, but of course they were, by definition, primitive compared to the Europeans. That doesn't mean they're less than human beings or anything. That's a different thing. But just their culture was sort of older, you could say, or not as advanced, not as developed in various ways. So anyway, they bring them to America, enslave them. That part's awful. But I think out of that grew racism. Once you have I think it's inevitable that the rulers sort of hate the slaves kind of hate the rulers, or the rulers look down on the slaves, etc. And then because you had this pattern of the whites and the blacks, then out of that developed this association, racism, that black people are like that and white people are like that. But yeah, there's some other misconceptions. So one is that, like, Noam Chomsky has said this a few times, and I'd like to see the evidence because I don't understand it. He seems to suggest America got a lot of its wealth from slavery. It doesn't seem to hold up. Like, if you look at, I think 90 or 95% of all the slaves in America were in the southern states. But I think the northern states, around that time, before 1850, were actually developing faster than the southern states. Like, economically, they had more railways, things like that. I don't know the exact details. I think I might have discussed this before a bit. but it doesn't really hold up. If you think of places, okay, so like Singapore, Switzerland, Japan had huge economic growth in the 20th century, and I don't think they had any slaves. It's got nothing to do with it. Again, what about before the slaves, that kind of part of it? In Europe, how did Europe get so far ahead of the Aboriginals in Australia or Africans or whatever? Was it through slaves? I mean, maybe that was some part of it, but I think it was mainly exchanging. That's what works. Again, free market capitalism or anything close to that is your best chance. Trading, no tariffs. Hong Kong is a good example. And meanwhile, you look at places where the most slavery occurred, or a lot of it, I think it's places like India, Africa itself, and other parts of Eastern Europe who are way behind economically. These days, I think there's still considered people that are effectively slaves in India and Africa and the main places. Like, why are they not shooting ahead of the rest of the world if slavery is so profitable? And yeah, in America, I think the southern states focused on like cotton farming, relatively basic drudgery and stuff, and the northern states were doing more advanced like manufacturing and stuff, using those products from the south. I think Brazil had slaves as well, and I remember hearing Thomas Sowell say something like, you would expect, if Noam Chomsky was right about this stuff, that the places where the slaves had existed should have ended up being the richer places, but I don't think it doesn't seem to hold up. I'm not buying it. Like, okay, there's no doubting. First off, slavery is terrible. I think it's bad, but it was worldwide, and it wasn't whites against blacks. It was those who were technologically advanced against those, or rich against those that were already poor. It did not help the poor. I totally agree with that. And yes, the rich get an advantage from enslaving people. It's terrible. But I actually think, for example, America would have progressed much better if those black people weren't slaves. People who are free to work and choose to work and then can compete with each other to work harder, you'd get way more economic growth, I think. I mean, I can't prove that. I think I sort of can in terms of logic. You got a bunch of people that have to work. Where's the incentive for them to work more? Other than whipping them. On the positive reinforcement works way better. On the other hand, you make them free and you say whoever works the most gets the most money, and you got them all trying to outdo each other, finding ways to do things more efficiently so you can save money, so they get a boost of money, they get rewarded. Again, free market capitalism, it's the way to go, man. So I don't think that makes sense. Slavery equals more money. I'm not convinced about that. Another thing is this idea of the legacy of slavery, like the fact that blacks are falling behind in modern times or relatively recent times. I think a lot of these statistics have come from around the 60s and later. But if you look at blacks, their situation actually rapidly got better and better throughout from 1850 to about 1950 or so over time without any special policies. And it's only after that you start seeing you see these effects of slavery 100 years later. Things like the marriage rate among blacks just fell apart, just started going really bad. Around the same time that, the welfare state was really growing, or affirmative action in the 60s. It's a classic thing of Adam Smith's quote about, when a person acts in their own self-interest, that's when they help society the most. And the critical second part of it, or roughly that's what he says in his The Wealth of Nations. I haven't read it, just that main part is just so logical. And also, I think some people critique it for being simplistic. You could critique Newton's laws of motion as being simplistic, or Pythagoras' theorem. Just because they're old and because they're clear cut doesn't mean they're bad. They still apply forever, for all time. And they're very succinct and effective. And I think Adam Smith's principle, of when you act in your self-interest, you help society. And that second part, when people try to help society, they often do a much poorer job of helping society than simply acting in their own self-interest. I think it's so true. And these affirmative action laws are an example. I could go into that, maybe a whole separate thing, maybe just a quick rough example. Something along the lines of, if you're helping families with welfare, I think there's actually kind of creating subsidies for families that break apart, Okay, if there's a black woman who gets pregnant, her husband might not be able to get that much money, especially if there's minimum wage laws making it hard for him to get started and get experience and get a job and get better jobs over time. If he can't even get started, then it may be better for her to be single and get payments from the government. She may get more than if she has a husband who's trying to work. It's incentivizing these minorities, these groups that would otherwise want to work. It's making it more profitable for them to not work. It's a very rational decision. And I think that's, you know, it's just, it doesn't make sense. Like, people blame it on slavery, but a lot of these problems, if you look at the statistics, they started around the 60s. And again, the government policies had great intentions, but as Adam Smith said, it doesn't always achieve what you want. So yeah, I don't know much else. Maybe I'll do another one on affirmative action laws later and civil rights. But just to summarize, so slavery is worldwide. It's been around for a long time, everywhere. It never had anything to do with race. It did not cause differences. Differences in, you know, weapons and technology occurred due to trading and isolation on the opposite side. Isolation is the best way to just make no progress. And then that enabled slavery to occur between races over vast distances, you know, grabbing a whole bunch of people from a continent. Slavery is not hugely profitable. The evidence doesn't point to that. I mean, after all, yeah, again, Europe got ahead of Africa, not through slavery, but through its own trading and technology, you know, competition. It's very far-fetched to suggest that slavery directly... I mean, obviously the blacks were way behind when they started in America, say in 1850, 1860. You know, but you can't blame the problems of the 60s and later on that. It's been too long a gap, and the statistics were actually reasonably good for blacks, or at least they were heading in a different direction, and it changed later on. And of course, if like, people seem to think of some people like Noam Chomsky just look so much down on Americans as just selfish, and, you know, like never mind how it became wealthy in the first place, but just, oh, it's got slaves and, you know, which I think has nothing to do with how it became wealthy. I think, look at where did slavery end, and you get England is one of the main answers. England and America were the ones that were actively trying to end slavery around the world and in their own countries. And it's, I mean, not all of the Americans, the Southerns, you know, the rednecks, well, you know, they wanted slavery, you know, but meanwhile, these other places where there are heaps of slaves, including plenty of white slaves owned by black people, or vice versa, all different races. And yeah, still we have this idea of the white, you know, privileged male. When the black males born in our generation, how are they disadvantaged? They're not slaves. Their parents weren't slaves. Their grandparents weren't slaves. There might have been segregation, but, you know, going back a long time, there have been some black people that were really successful. It's just strange that it's like there's this conspiracy holding everyone down. And what about Japanese Americans? Or other various groups, I think Asians in Australia as well, who perform above the average of white people. How do you explain that? How? Magic? Just magic? Like, people don't look at that kind of aspect. Anything that contradicts their point of view, you know, Noam Chomsky is not going to mention, oh, Hong Kong when it comes to, you know, slavery, giving people lots of money, or these other, like India and Africa, who are just way behind. And I'm pretty sure they've had a lot of slaves. Again, I don't know the details, but it doesn't hold up. And I can't remember if I mentioned, but yeah, in Brazil, the places where you had more slavery, you would expect to become richer than the places where there wasn't much slavery. But I don't think that occurred. So yeah, anyway, okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching. Bye.